So this is Shabbat, we know. It's also the last day of Pesach. So it is both a Shabbat and a Yom Tov. It is a holy day filled with the joys of Shabbat rest and the celebration of Passover. And usually I would speak about freedom and justice as fundamental to understanding Passover and the Exodus, and it is, to be sure, but there's a feeling among many who felt that the joys of celebrating Pesach, our Passover, was a bit more fleeting. It was harder. It felt more obligatory or confusing. Some feel after a second year of Seders through screens, or after the horrible, horrible shooting in our community, that it's not just the message of leaving Egypt, but it kind of feels like we've been returning to Egypt. Returning rather than escaping. Or maybe even that Egypt is chasing after us so that we can't even escape it, even if we tried. I'm going to invite you to kind of take a breath and listen to a remembrance that I think might have some wisdom for us. It's not my remembrance. It's an illustration, a beautiful illustration from a physician who describes the lesson of Passover that she learned as a little girl from her grandfather. Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen wrote a book called My Grandfather's Blessings, Stories of Strength, Refuge, and Belonging. Might be time to reread her book from 20 years ago. In it, she says that her grandfather spoke to her always as Neshamala. Neshama is a soul, so Neshamala is the little soul. And she remembers that when she was very, very little, the Seder was a total mystery to her. Everything was in Hebrew. It took hours to complete, and no one was allowed to eat anything until it was almost time for bed. She wrote, "I'm never going to one of these again," she remembers sobbing to her grandfather. "I hate Passover. I hate that stupid story." And the grandfather would look at her and say, "Oh, Neshamala." And she would add, "He told me his own version of the Passover story." And it goes like this. Thousands and thousands of years ago, the Jewish people were slaves in Egypt. Like slaves everywhere, they suffered greatly, but they had a dream of freedom. Their leader, Moses, spoke to God about the dream and the terrible suffering, and God told him to go to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and tell him to let the Jewish people go. And not surprisingly, Pharaoh refused. Moses was very discouraged, and he went back to God for help because Pharaoh hardened his heart. God sends suffering upon all the land of Egypt in the form of these plagues. Suffering has great power to soften the heart, her grandfather said. But the Pharaoh still refused to free the slaves, so God sent another plague and another. But Pharaoh had hardened his heart to both the suffering of the Jews and the suffering of the Egyptians. He makes promises to Moses and then goes back on them. And finally, God sends the angel of death to take the firstborn of every Egyptian family. This is too much even for the hard heart of Pharaoh. And he then tells Moses that the Jews are to go free. And then our gifted writer, as a little girl, asks, "Is that the end of the story, Grandpa?" And he answers to her gently, "No, actually, it's only the beginning." She remembers being very pleased. If the Seder had been so long, she was certain the story was going to be longer. So what happened next, she asks. And he continues, "Moses brings the news of their freedom to the rest of the people." And she asks, "Are they very happy, Grandpa?" And he says, "No, Neshamala, they're not. They told Moses they didn't want to go. They asked many questions. Where are we going? Who's going to feed us? Where will we sleep?" Moses was really surprised. He couldn't answer any of these questions, and he did not know what in the world to do. How could he tell God that after all God had done to make freedom possible, that the people didn't want to go? She asks, but they were suffering, Grandpa. Why didn't they want to go? And her grandfather suddenly looked very sad. And he explained to her, they knew how to suffer. That they had done for a long time, and they were used to it. They didn't know how to be free. When Moses went back to tell God what happened, God was not surprised at all. He said to Moses, tell the people that I myself will lead them out of Egypt to the promised land. Now, her grandfather declared emphatically, now, this is a very rare thing. Usually, God sends others to carry out God's will, like an angel or a messenger. But this God is going to do it, in his words, himself. I'd say God's self, but he said himself. And Moses tells this to the people, and they finally agree to leave their homes and start out across a desert. There's no food there. There's no water. And they wander around for 40 years. And this little girl was just shocked. What about the promised land, Grandpa? Wasn't it true? And of course he says, oh yes, Neshamala, it was true. But the choice people have to make is never between slavery and freedom. We will always have to choose between slavery and the unknown. Slavery and the unknown. She asks, how can they live without food or water? And he says, they have God, Neshamala. Every morning, God rains down manna from heaven and the people eat it. By noon, it has evaporated. Every night, they find shelter beneath the wings of God's presence. Day after day, they worry and doubt. And day after day, God is there. And after 40 years, they finally learn that God can be trusted. Then they come to their promised land. Our narrator tells us she sat for a long time while thinking of this story, her mind full of pictures. One of them was an image of a long, ragged line of people weighted down with all of their baggage. And at the head of this procession is God in the form of a pillar of fire. And she asks her grandfather, why does God come himself? And he would say back to her, oh, Neshamala. Many people have puzzled over this very question and found many different answers. What I think is that the struggle toward freedom is too important. It's too important for God to leave to others. And this is so because the only people who can serve God's holy purpose and repair a broken world are the people who become free. Only those who are not enslaved by something else can follow the goodness that is deep inside of them. Our story informs us, our storyteller informs us that it's nearly 25 years before she went to another Seder. And this time the service was virtually all in English and everybody participated. And the part she read, she tells us, contained what she thought was an obscure command from God. It states that in every generation, it is a parent's obligation to tell their children the Passover story and specifies precisely how this is to be done. And they say, and you shall tell your child on that day, saying, it is because of what God did for me when I went forth out of Egypt. The phrase is repeated 2 or 3 more times throughout the Haggadah. And she asked herself, why should God insist that something that happened thousands of years ago be personalized in this way? And then she admits she found the truth in it. The story my grandfather had told me, she realized, did not happen thousands of years in the past. It's happening now. It is the story, she now understands, of every patient she had ever treated, every person she had ever known. It is even, she concludes, my own story. Indeed, the story is the same for every one of us. I was drawn to her story about her grandfather and her as a little girl and as an adult for three reasons. One is the choice people have to make, she said. He said, grandfather said, the choice people have to make is never between slavery and freedom. We will always have to choose between slavery and the unknown. I think we're being confronted with lots of unknowns right now. The unknown if this pandemic will really end and we will go back to life as we knew it, or are we going to have to adjust? Is it getting better? Sure, but after a year, we're fatigued. Somewhat concerned about how to move forward, even how I'm going to feel ready. And people are asking, myself included, what trauma has this left us with? What anxiety has found a residence in our bodies? And what about this terrible shooting? Experts say that when parents talk to their children about it, they're supposed to tell the children that they're safe. But a lot of our parents are telling me that's not how they feel. So how do they say it? So experts are going to say, tell them that you're going to feel safe right now together. Well, that makes sense. But I think the struggle is with the unknowing. And it's becoming a greater burden than before. The second text says the struggle toward freedom is too important for God to leave to others. But that is what happened. Eventually, God is leaving it for us. And all the while, God never leaves the Israelites when they were afraid or feeling despair. God never leaves us, I believe, so deeply when we are feeling wounded, uneasy, or distant, even from ourselves. And the third part that spoke to me is when he said, quotes the text from the Haggadah, actually, you shall tell your child on that day, saying, it is because of what I did, of what God did for me when I went forth out of Egypt. I think God opened the door, and God accompanied those ancient ancestors of ours. So for me, it's a model of sacred accompanying. That's what I believe we need to do, sacred accompanying. Walk with one another. Can we go to the market for the first time with a friend? Maybe for this first 2 or 3 or 4 times. Can we share our feelings, our real feelings with one another, with our people, so that we can let go of some of the heavy burden, knowing that it doesn't really go away, but it can feel lighter? Can we journey toward a promised land together, knowing that we don't have control over everything, no matter how much we think we can? And that it can be scary, but we are moving step by step toward building a better life together. So here's my prayer. Adonai, you abide though all things change. I am anxious and fearful. I turn my heart to you, looking to you and leaning on your strength. It is written, blessed is the one whose strength is in you. Bless me now with that strength, with faith and courage. Help me to feel that you are with me, steadying and sustaining me with the assurance that I am loved. And right now, I am safe. Be with me and bring me hope that in the days to come, my aspirations may be fulfilled for my good and for the good of those who I love, who depend on me. Banish my fears with the sense that you are always present to uphold and sustain me. As it reads from the prophet Isaiah, have no fear, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with the power of my righteousness. Oziv Zimratia. God, you are the source of my strength and the source of my song. I invite you to say with me, Amen. And take a breath. And let's move toward our conclusion. Aleinu l'shabeh